This week on the Retirement Quick Tips podcast, I'm talking about the upcoming presidential election and what that means for you and your retirement. Today, I'm talking about the historical outcomes of the election. If we go back about 100 years and looking at all those election cycles, how do stock markets, how do bond markets, how does the economy, how does that do under various combinations of Democrats, Republicans in the White House, Democrats and Republicans in Congress? How do markets do leading up to an election? And then also in the months after. Looking at history, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And so there's a lot we can glean from this. And I think a lot of solace we can take especially if you're really anxious about the election. So let's take a look at this. So first of all, we have good data about markets in election years going back to 1927. But the problem is there have only been 24 presidential elections since then. So it's not a huge number to draw any significant conclusions from. And more than the election, the state of the economy in an election year, for better or worse, will impact markets much, much more. This year, the economy is growing. There's a lot of excitement about AI, and the Fed has now started to reduce interest rates. So those three factors are driving the markets, and the election so far has had pretty much zero impact on the markets. Now, as we get closer to the election, we're in the last couple of weeks here in the home stretch, you might see some more volatility, but a couple of weeks of volatility, it's like, who cares? It's not like the market crashes right before an election. And right after, I know some people are worried about unrest after the election. That doesn't have much impact on markets either. I mean, if you look back to the summer of 2020, there were riots all over the country in cities. In Portland, where I live, there was like 100 days in a row of riots. And this was happening to a lesser extent all across the country. Markets didn't care. Markets did very well that summer. If you're concerned about the volatility or like a big crash right before or after, depending on who's elected, I wouldn't be worried at all. I would not be concerned at all about that. History shows, and right now we're seeing this with this election cycle, the markets do not react all that much to political outcomes. So one interesting conclusion about looking at this historically is that the stock market tends to perform slightly worse than average in an election year. But even this isn't all that helpful because more than half of the calendar 12-month periods following each presidential election, that also overlapped with an official U.S. recession. So again, it's what's the cart, what's the horse? The recession is what caused the market to not perform well, not the election outcome or the fact that there was election during that time. So again, it is the economic climate that is driving performance of the markets, not the election noise. And markets likely performed worse in the presidential election year since the market tends to turn south before the economy does. So if we go into recession in 2025 and you see this downturn in the market right around the time of the election, chances are it's not even related to the election. It's the fact that the stock market's always on the leading edge of the recession. You see that turn down pretty much 100% of the time before the economy itself actually deteriorates. As I mentioned, there is a little bit of volatility close to the election. It was actually at its highest historically in the 1 month and 3 months prior to voting day. So we're already past that, and we haven't really seen any uptick in volatility. And then if we look at the outcome and afterwards, who's in the White House, who's in Congress, what do markets do the best under? Well, if you look at history, it actually didn't matter all that much if there was a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. What mattered was the makeup of Congress. It actually performed worse under the worst of all combinations, Republican president, Democrats in Congress. And there's varying degrees. Republican president, Republican Congress did pretty well. Democrat president, Republican Congress also did pretty well. But you know what does the best when you look at market performance and the makeup of the White House and Congress is if we have a divided Congress. The takeaway here is that you don't want to get caught up in anticipating outcomes or making big changes to your portfolio because of the election. Markets don't seem to care all that much about what is happening in politics. And the best scenario that we can hope for, regardless of who's president, is a divided Congress, because they cannot just ram through dramatic policy changes. They have to work together. They have to build consensus. They have to do what's right for the American people. Who would have thought? So that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Ashley Michike, and this is the Retirement Quick Tips Podcast.